Welcome into the fifth ever episode of Canadian Basketball Weekly here on the Maple Minute. As always, I'm your host, Elliot Russenholt. Got a little bit of a jam-packed week this week. We're going to do a little bit of recap. We're going to preview some stuff, as always, but we're going to keep you up to date with what's going on here in Canadian basketball. We're going to do it once again. It'll be every week. It's always the same thing every week. We're going to start with the NBA Canadian of the Week. Jumping right in here, as always. I think it has to be Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I really don't think it can be anybody else. He's just putting up unreal numbers. He is leading the MVP race. He's showing everybody what Canadian basketball is about and what it's going to be about. I think we're right in the golden generation right now, and you got to just enjoy it while it's here because, yeah, he's been absolutely nuts. He's probably the leader for the MVP race. I think it'd be crazy for him to win MVP. Be obviously the first Canadian since Steve Nash, another PG, which is pretty cool. But yeah, his game is so smooth. He's been so unreal. Moving on to the NCAA Canadian Standout of the Week, I wanted this to be somebody different, but after going off against every single opponent that he's played against in the last 4 conference games, it has to be Zach Edey. He put up 35 and 20 against Iowa, against another Canadian, Ben Krieke. Shout out Ben Krieke. He had a great performance against the Boilermakers. Didn't matter. Zach Edey was unreal. So it had to be Zach. I'm hopefully somebody else and someone who we'll mention later in the show has a huge game. That'd be really great to see. So hopefully it's somebody else next week. I'll make sure it is somebody else. But I had to shout out Zach Edey. He's playing so well. It's really hard not to give him the nod again for another week. So we're gonna, just before we get into the U Sports stuff, gonna quickly jump down to some high school level stuff, some stuff here in Manitoba. There were 3 major tournaments that happened this weekend: the Trojan Classic, the Centurion Shootout, and one of the biggest tournaments in the entire city. It's been running for 47 years now, the Winnipeg Invitational Tournament. We're going to start with the results of the Trojan Classic. The host, Vincent Massey Trojans, won the final over the Kildonan East Reavers. They beat KE, got to the final, Vincent Massey got to the final by beating Miles Mack. And then KE got to the final by beating Garden City. In that third place was Miles Mack in Garden City. Miles Mack ended up winning third place. We'll get to my rankings here in a minute. There's a bit of a shakeup, but we'll get to why here in a second. In the Winnipeg Invitational Tournament, the Sisler Spartans ended up winning the tournament over the Crocus Plains. Crocus Plains ended up beating Oak Park to get to that final. It was a great game. And then Oak Park ended up winning in the third place game. So they salvage a third place in a weekend where they should have been in the final against Sisler. It was chalked up for them, but have to give it out to Noah Mula and his Crocus Plains team for having a really good game against a still good, but without Taven Vigilance Raiders squad. Then in the Centurion Shootout, it was exactly how the final was supposed to be drawn up. It was Daniel McIntyre versus Dakota Collegiate, and the Maroons, after a good start to the game from the Lancers, the Maroons end up just waiting them out, and they end up beating them in the final. So we're going to have a shakeup in the rankings here in a moment when I mention it. And shout out Transcona Collegiate. They end up winning third place over the host, Fort Richmond Centurions. So that's really good for TCI. I think they're one of the sleepers. There's a couple sleeper teams this year. There's some tiers, and I can get into it another time, but there's definitely some tiers to teams, but there's definitely some sleepers who could make some noise later this year. There's no major tournaments upcoming this weekend, but I did want to give you guys my new updated rankings for this week. We have a new number 1, and it is the Vincent Massey Trojans. They won their tournament. They won their home tournament. They swept the weekend. They really had no trouble with anybody. So they obviously get top spot. I'm only going to knock the Lancers down 1 spot because they went flawlessly through the weekend except for that final. And DMCI is a pretty good team. They're another one of the mid-tier sleeper teams that I think could make some noise. I talked about it in my article last week. If you haven't read it, go read it now. But they were a sleeper last year, and I think they're a sleeper again this year. And so right behind the Lancers, I have the DMCI Maroons. I believe that the Maroons are in third because they shouldn't be ahead of the Lancers because Dakota dismantled them in Brandon. Dakota went quite cold in the second half after having a pretty hot start to the game. So you can't, as much as you want to say that the Maroons are better than the Lancers, I still think the Lancers are better than the Maroons right now. It was just a one good game effort from the Maroons. Now, moving into that 4 spot, only dropping 1 place. Obviously, the Maroons jumped 2 places from last week. Miles Mac Buckeyes, they luckily stay in 4th place here. It could have been even more disastrous. They got smoked by the Trojans in the semifinal of the Trojan Classic. They got smoked, but then they salvaged and they ended up beating the Garden City Gophers in that 3rd place game. Right behind the Buckeyes is the Gophers. They'll sit in the 5th place. They only bumped down a spot. They had a pretty shaky weekend. You could also argue the team that is now behind them could actually be ahead of them. I think that's a very valid argument. But Garden City obviously slumps against KE, and then they slumped against the Buckeyes. So it's hard to keep them in that top 5, but they're going to stay at 5 for now. We'll see how the rest of the week, obviously going into next week, shakes out. Number 6 is the Kildonan East Reavers. They obviously pick up a big win over the Gophers, and then they keep it somewhat close against the Trojans, but it's just not enough. I think if they beat the Trojans, obviously we have a different conversation for who's number 1 this week. But I think if it's even a couple point game, I think they move ahead of the Gophers, but they sit in that 6 slot. Number 7, I'm going to bump them from 9 to 7. Obviously, KU moved from 8 to 6, excuse me. The Sisler Spartans move from 9 to 7. They win the WIT. They beat technically they beat Crocus Plains, who ended up beating Oak Park in the previous round. So I'm going to give the Spartans a nod. Shout out David Sharma, ended up winning MVP for the WIT. He's a great player. Hopefully I can get a player spotlight out on him soon. Great scorer, and I think he's a really good rebounder for his size. But yeah, he won tournament MVP. He had a great weekend. Was really impressed watching lots of his games. He was hitting shots. Obviously, he was rebounding. I thought it was a great weekend for the Spartans. In number 8 is the St. Paul's Crusaders. They didn't play any tournament games this week, but they held their spot. They didn't really have to play anybody too important in terms of league games or anything. So it wasn't anything of note. They do drop a couple spots here, but that's just because they didn't play, and there were some other teams that moved around above them in the rankings. Number 9 is the Oak Park Raiders. Obviously, they lose to an unranked Crocus Plains team. You could even argue that they should be out of the rankings. I think they sit at number 9. They could have been number 10. I was humming and hawing about that, but I think they're 9 because they still won 3rd place. If they had gotten 4th place, I think they're either out of the rankings or at 10, but I think they're at 9. You probably could argue that they should be ahead of the Crusaders just because they played games, but I also want to not have St. Paul's drop too far. It's not fair. They didn't play any games. And then at number 10 is the Maples Marauders. Again, quiet week for them. They didn't play, so it's hard to knock them, obviously, moving any further. And I don't really want to knock them out of the top 10 because, obviously, again, same situation with St. Paul's. They didn't play. So now we're going to get into the U Sports Player of the Week. And unfortunately, for me, it was very difficult to pick a Player of the Week. So lucky for all of you, I ended up picking 2. And it was from this entire weekend. I'm going to lump this in with the Game of the Week. It was an unreal weekend in the Canada West. I don't want to sound very, very, very biased or anything, but it was it lived up to the billing, even without Diego Mafia. The U of M Bisons versus the Victoria Vikes. It was a nuts weekend. Both games were absolutely unreal. First game of the weekend, Simon Hildebrand had 41 points. Career high. He hit, I believe it was 8 threes. He was on fire. The Bisons needed him to do that to beat the Vikes. I believe because also Ronaldo Robinson, who ended up having 46 in the second meeting and getting the Vikes to victory in that one, was also very good in the first game. So both teams had a player go absolutely nuclear. Both games were really high scoring. So could be a Ken West final preview. And can you imagine if that game had Diego Mafia? That would have been unreal. It was game of the weekend for me. Both games at the Investors Group Athletic Center had each team putting on a show. It was unreal. If you're able to go back and watch the games, if you haven't, highly would recommend. It was insane. Before we move on and we get to the other portion or the other half of the show where I preview some stuff for the next week, just want to plug the Maple Minute. We've got stuff popping out all the time. We've got articles. We've got insight. If you haven't signed up for the service, if you're a coach watching this, it doesn't matter if you're prep or if you are a university coach at any level, CCAA, U Sports, Division 3, 2, or 1, JUCO, anything, you should be subscribed to the Maple Minute. That's all I got to say. We've got all things Canadian basketball, not just the show. We've got all the insight all across the country. If you want anything related to recruiting Canadians, we are the honey hole for recruiting Canadians here in the country. Also, going to do a little shameless plug. I did release an article today. We'll probably get the rankings up very soon. That's why I'm sharing them here in this video. But I'm going to be doing now every week a Manitoba 4A high school player spotlight. This week it was Jeremiah Ige of the Vincent Massey Trojans. If you haven't checked that out already, please do. Obviously follow us on all socials at the Maple Minute on Instagram or on Twitter as TMM Recruiting. Follow Josh Millican as well. He's at the Maple Minute on Twitter, and I believe he is something along the lines of Josh Millican on Instagram as well. And follow us on YouTube. Just put in the Maple Minute. Subscribe down below. Comment. Tell us what you want to see. Tell us if I missed anything. Keep us in the loop about things. Whatever. Go down low. Like, share, subscribe. Do all the stuff for the algorithm. It's very much appreciated. So we're going to get into the U Sports matchup of the weekend now, having just talked about what happened this past weekend. Let's talk about the matchup of the week. We'll get into the rankings here in a moment. And there's a new number one again in U Sports rankings. Obviously, I don't make my own U Sports rankings. This is coming from the U Sports organization. The University of Ottawa GGs are now back from 2 to number 1. They are taking on number 4 Laurier. They have had a huge jump. They went from 2 weeks ago being unranked in 11th to last week being in 7th, and they're now in 4th. So crazy weekend, crazy last couple of weeks for Laurier. The Golden Hawks are going to take on the GGs this weekend. I believe that is on Saturday, the Saturday matchup. Laurier also plays Carleton as well on Friday, so that should be another good matchup. I know Carleton's been slipping, but they're still a very quality team. So we're going to go through the rankings now. Obviously, I already spoiled it. Number 1 is University of Ottawa GGs. University of Victoria only drops 1 spot to number 2. They jump from 1 to 2. Don't move far. University of Queens, or Queens University, however you want to say it, doesn't move at all. They are staying at number 3. They've been very consistent this year. Number 4, obviously, as I already said, is Laurier. They've moved up 3 spots. The University of British Columbia actually dropped 1 spot. They went from 4 now to 5. The University of Manitoba moved from 7 to 6, so they moved up 1 spot. It's kind of fair. They beat Victoria in the first game, but didn't beat them in the full slate. I think they move up way further, and Victoria drops way further, I think, if U of M sweeps. But they only move up to 1 spot, but it's still good for them. University of St. Francis Xavier moves from 5 to 7 now this week. They're number 7. They get bumped. Western University stays at number 8. Toronto Metropolitan moves from number 10 to number 9. And Calgary this week moves in from number 11, or just outside the rankings, to number 10. The U of W Westman, who didn't play, actually get bumped from the rankings. So very interesting there. But the Dinos had a pretty good weekend, so they should be in at number 10. Now, on to the NCAA Canadian matchup of the week. Going back to Vachon Ouellette, he's been unreal in conference play. I know it hasn't been resulting in wins for Old Dominion, but I have a sneaking suspicion that one of these big games he has leads to a victory. They're playing 17-2 James Madison at home this weekend. So should be really, really interesting to see how Ouellette takes on a really good opponent, a team who should be in the NCAA tournament come March. We'll see how that goes. I have a feeling there might be an upset brewing this weekend with the Monarchs. And finally, the NBA Canadian matchup of the week. Friday night, the Raptors take on the Clippers at home at Scotiabank Arena. RJ Barrett's been unreal. He is taking things to another level here in Toronto. He is so ready for the spotlight. I'm so happy to have a Canadian in a Canadian market doing well, being a star. It's the best. As much as I'm not a Raptors fan, it's just really good for Canadian basketball. And they're taking on the hot Clippers team, obviously with Kawhi, PG, and Harden. This is a good LA Clippers squad. So it should be a very good matchup on Friday night. So that is it, everybody, for another week of Canadian Basketball Weekly here on the Maple Minute. As I said, follow us on all socials, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. I believe we should be getting some TikTok stuff going too. Follow me on Twitter at Elliot Russenholt. Keep up to date on all things Canadian basketball here at the Maple Minute. And I will see you guys next week for episode 6. Peace out.